better weaken the movement.
Thanks very much for that comment, Evelyn. I've been confined to the lectern here. I was wandering too much, apparently, so I will be well behaved and stay behind here. By the way, I do also do that in my writing. People have different approaches. I'm very restless, so I will sit down for 5 minutes writing, and then I will wander around the room and think. Some of you may sit for hours and hours, but I think, you know, express your different ways of going about academic work if you're like me. Let's move on now to looking at structure, because I don't want lunch to get too late. But thank you for all those really important contributions and discussions. People frame this in slightly different ways, but introduction, you can see there's no literature review section on this, so others there's a bit more flexibility. So I've just done a slightly elaborated version of that, but with some nuances. And I work in the field of education, which is partly a multidisciplinary area, but it does have some particular characteristics. So this may be different in the fields that you're working in. But we publish we publish quantitative, qualitative, and purely theoretical pieces, and they follow slightly different structures. So, generally speaking, quantitative ones do follow the IMRD structure, although you might have literature review as a separate section. You might have a background section. This is particularly true of international studies, and this is a very political term, because if you do a study in Milwaukee, you probably wouldn't consider it to be international, but if you do a study in Lagos, you might consider it to be international, depending on the journal. Of course, everything is both international and not, but these are the biases. In any event, it's good practice for an international journal to give some contextual background, that the essential things that the reader needs to know. Depending on the kind of paper that you write, that might need to be quite a substantial section. So if you're writing a qualitative analysis, or if you're writing a policy critique of higher education in Botswana for an international journal, you really do need to give some background on Botswanan politics and higher education policy. Otherwise, if you launch straight into the documentary analysis, the reader's going to be completely at sea, other than local readers. So this background section might be a separate section depending on the journal and the article. And then you might have a separate conclusion that's different from the discussion. For a qualitative paper, it tends not to work very well to separate results from discussion, because it's quite hard to present findings from a qualitative paper without discussing them, other than just handing somebody your interview transcripts. And it tends to be hard to discuss without presenting findings. So most qualitative studies will meld these together in some kind of way, and often structure thematically in different ways. So please, if you're writing a qualitative study, do not feel forced to have a findings or results and discussion separate sections. It usually doesn't work very well. And you might have a theoretical framework section, you might in a quantitative paper that's separate, and so forth. Purely theoretical papers that aren't presenting any empirical data at all have a slightly different structure. Usually there's no method section, although the introduction must have some methodological reflection. So you're not going to go through all data collection and ethics and so forth, but you do need to say something about your method. It's usually in this section. The structure is going to be, the structure depends on the theme, of course, but there is, at some point, you need to frame what you're doing in relation to existing work. It's not going to be a literature review in the traditional sense, but you need to locate what you're doing within what is already known and argued, and then you need to present what is new about your theoretical contribution or argument. So those are some common ways of structure. Now, I'm not presenting this in a normative sense. I'm presenting it in a descriptive sense. These are how articles commonly structure themselves. It doesn't mean that it's essential, and it doesn't mean that it's necessarily the best way to go about it. But if you're going to experiment with structure, make sure you've got a very good reason for doing it, because journals tend to the conservative side, and you don't know who's going to be reviewing your paper. So if you're very iconoclastic with your structure, you're taking a risk, and you have to have good reasons for taking that risk. Discuss it with other people. If you're, I would really encourage people to experiment, but have good reasons for doing that. What I'd like you to do now is to look at the articles that you've pulled up. We haven't got a huge amount of time for a painstaking analysis, but just have a look through them. And then with the person sitting next to you, or if you're across a table in a small group, I'd like you to reflect together on how closely the articles that are published in the journal you've been looking at reflect any of these structures, the IMRD. Or just before we do that, just a very quick mention of some other sections. So you will also find articles having some other mini sections that we'll be looking at. References, of course, footnotes, keywords, tables, figures, appendices at the end. These do depend quite a lot on the kind of article. Acknowledgements is a really important section for which you can insert at the end for putting in things that either anonymity won't let you put in the main bit of the article, or that you feel might prejudice the reviewers. So while it really shouldn't make any difference, some people might be prejudiced by the fact that a piece of research came out of a PhD study. So, but you might ethically, or for some other reason, want to put in that this came out of a PhD study if you're not publishing with a supervisor. You can put that in the acknowledgement section before it's published. Or if it's come from, if for anonymity reasons you don't want to put in the particular funded research or so forth, you can put it there. Keywords, I really wouldn't worry too much about. Some people spend hours and hours working out their keywords. It's nothing stands or falls on this. Avoid extensive footnotes. If you go back to the classic works of the 19th century, there's more in the footnotes than there is in the actual text, but they tend not to be looked at very positively by journals nowadays. Okay, so let's go back to the activity then. Have a look at your articles. Do they conform to any one of these structures, or do they depart from